Hey folks, it's Sarah, and I am here to wrap up Victober with my very meager addition to the Victober festivities. For those who don't know, Victober is a reading challenge to read works of Victorian literature during the month of October. Victorian literature being defined as anything published within the UK during the reign of Queen Victoria, which I believe was 1837 to 1901. Victober is hosted by 5 channels this year, including Kate Howe, Blatantly Bookish, Petra Yu, Scandy Dandelion About the Books, and Books and Things. This is my first Victober, and I realized one of my books on my shelf had two stories that qualified for one of Victober's challenges. Marissa's challenge for Victober was to read a Victorian short story, and I happen to have a book called Women's Weird, Strange Stories by Women, 1890 to 1940, and this is published by Handheld Press, a really great publisher in the UK. The very first stories count as Victober contributions. They're written during the Victorian, the reign of Queen Victoria. So I read both stories and really loved them, so I thought I would give a quick update. So in general, this book, the introduction itself provides a really great definition for what weird fiction is. It describes weird fiction as fiction that addresses the strange aspects of the world around us, otherworldly aspects that can't be explained by either science or religion. So we think of a lot of supernatural elements to various fiction. Works of fiction might be defined as weird fiction, but more than anything, it's a sensation more than a set of defined characteristics. When you read a weird story, you just know you're reading a weird story. And they actually reference a book that I have called The Weird, a compendium of strange and dark stories, and it's edited by Anne and Jeff Vandermeer. And so Women's Weird actually mentions that this collection has a wonderful introduction or piece in it by the Vandermeers that talks about what is weird fiction, how do we define it, and what do we look for when we're looking for a weird fiction. The introduction also goes into detail about how women's fiction during this time period and other time periods was often dismissed as riffing off of or even copycatting fiction being written by men during the same time period. My upstairs neighbors, oh my God. But then they point out that some of these themes and imagery and stories in general written by women actually predate a lot of the fiction that's being written by men. So, sometimes it's, the female writers who were there first writing these weird themed stories. So the first story in the collection is called The Weird of the Walfords, and it's written by Louisa Baldwin. And it was originally published in 1889 and then republished in 1895. And the version here is the one published in 1895. And this is a story of a young man who has inherited his family's estate. And I'm just going to read the first sentence to you. On a summer's day in the year 1860, I, Humphrey Walford, did a deed for which I should have been disinherited by my father and disowned by my ancestors. I laid sacrilegious hands on the old carved oak 4-post family bedstead and destroyed it. So this story is about Humphrey and this bed that he has inherited from his family, and the bed has been in his family for something like 300 years. And every single person in his family has been born on this bed and has died in this bed. And as you can imagine, poor Humphrey has some traumatic memories based around death and this bed. And so he comes to believe that the bed is cursed. And when his own father dies, he decides that he has to destroy the bed. And so he does. And that decision comes back to haunt him. And this story is so great. It has so many of the elements of like a classic Gothic Victorian story. It has really, really heightened emotion and a really big, creepy, grand estate and kind of a conflict between old and new worlds. So Humphrey goes to America and finds a bride in America and brings her back to his family's land and the grand old estate, and she just marvels at the house and everything. And then of course there's this idea of this family curse that's all related to the bed itself. So very atmospheric, a lot of fun, great story. And Louisa Baldwin herself, she lived from 1845 to 1925. And her older sister, Alice Kipling, was actually the mother of Rudyard Kipling. And Louisa herself was the mother of Stanley Baldwin, who would go on to become prime minister. And she published, Louisa Baldwin published several novels and then also a collection of supernatural stories called it's called The Shadow on the Blind and Other Ghost Stories. And this story, The Weird of the Walfords, appeared in that collection. The next story I read was called Let Loose by Mary Cholmondeley, and this was published in 1890. So Let Loose is one of those stories where the narrator is telling you a story that they heard from someone else. So it starts with this young guy who's kind of obsessed with architecture and art, and he meets another guy who is also similarly obsessed with art and architecture, and this other guy he meets wears these really elaborate collars, these really high collars. And so the narrator asks this man, like, why do you wear such splendid collars? And the man says, well, I'll tell you why I wear such splendid collars. And he proceeds to give this story. And the rest of the short story is really this guy telling us the reason why he's wearing these high starched collars all the time and is never seen without them. And so the story basically is this guy, after the death of his father, is going through his father's papers and finds sketches, I believe, of these frescoes that had been found on the walls of an ancient crypt in a church that was in a remote village in the countryside. So this guy decides he has to go see these frescoes. And so he takes this elaborate, long journey to this village, and he goes to the church and he goes to the clergyman. He finally gets there, goes to the clergyman and says, can you let me into the crypt? I am really interested in these frescoes. And the clergyman says, well, the crypt has been locked for 30 years and no one has been down there in that time. I cannot open the crypt for you. And so of course the narrator proceeds to convince the clergyman to unlock the crypt, and hijinks ensue. And so the rest of the story is kind of what happens when the crypt is finally opened after 30 years. And, there's the sense that 30 years ago, something horrible had happened in the crypt, or related to the crypt. And so that's why nobody has been allowed down there for 30 years. And so then the story plunges into dark horror from there. On an interesting note, I am also reading Dracula with my husband right now, and Dracula was published in 1897, so 7 years after this story was published. And I want to read one passage from Let Loose and then read another passage from Dracula here. So from Let Loose, the whole village seemed composed of a straggling row of one-storied gray stone houses, the same color as the stone walls that separated the few fields enclosed from the surrounding waste, and as the little bridges over the beck that ran down one side of the gray, wide street. Everything was gray. And so then Dracula, which my husband and I are both reading, also counts for Victober. But I think this is from Mina's journal. Today is a gray day, and the sun, as I write, is hidden in thick clouds high over Kettleness. Everything is gray, except the green grass, which seems like emerald amongst it, gray earthy rock, gray clouds tinged with the sunburst at the far edge hang over the gray sea, into which the sand points stretch like gray fingers. The sea is tumbling in over the shallows and the sandy flats with a roar, muffled in the sea mists drifting inland. The horizon is lost in a gray mist. And that also actually reminds me of the opening of Wizard of Oz, but it's just interesting that there's that similar, you open with Dorothy talking about how everything in Kansas is gray, 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 gray. Even Auntie M is gray. The prairie is gray. The sun had baked the earth so that it was gray. I guess that's a pretty standard way to kind of set up a scene where you want everything to be dreary and ominous and heavy, but let the reader know that something major is about to happen. Some cyclone is going to come in. Some ship is going to arrive on that gray ocean. Some strange presence is going to appear in this gray, old gray village. So the author Mary lived from 1859 to 1925, and her father was a reverend, and she left school when she was 16 to help him work in his parish. And she wrote several novels and a memoir, and I think her most famous novel was called Red Pottage, which apparently caused a scandal when it was first written because it depicted adultery and the emancipation of women, and I think because of the way it depicted the clergy as well. So going back to that idea from the introduction that women were often accused of kind of taking ideas from the fiction that men had been writing, Mary Cholmondeley herself actually had to defend herself against plagiarism for this actual story. Some people claimed that she had copied another story that was about a crypt and a vampire that had been written by a man, but that story was actually published, I think, like 10 years after this story, Let Loose, had been published. So it was just some interesting history that's included within the book. I hope you are all enjoying your spooky season and celebrating Victober, if that's something that you celebrate in October. And if you haven't had a chance yet to check out Handheld Press's website, they have some really cool books. So I would highly recommend checking them out. There's actually a second edition of this collection called, I think it's called Weird Women 2. So check that out. I think I'm gonna go read a book. I hope you do something similarly fabulous. Mom, thanks for watching. I love you, and I'll see you all later. Bye.